Hello everyone. Today's lecture is going to pick up where we left off last time and start talking about the history of the English language from the very earliest stages. And by that, I don't mean the earliest documents of English, I mean its precursors. What do we know about what came before English? What came before any of the English language documents that we have today? So we're going to talk about linguistic family trees and relatedness, and we're going to talk about the Indo-European and Germanic roots of English. We will also talk about regular sound change and linguistic reconstruction, because these are crucial for understanding how it is that it means something to talk about Germanic or Indo-European in the first place, and English being a part of those families. We'll also talk about long-term grammatical change, certain grammatical changes that happened in the prehistory of English. We will have an interlude of talking about the different writing systems that we find in the world's languages, and also the history of writing systems in English and other languages. And finally, we'll talk about prospects for going back even further in time than that, and looking before the Indo-European language family. Just a quick reminder, there are 4 tutorial groups. One of our groups will, as a complete exception, this week be on Tuesday at 1:30 rather than on Wednesday because of the public holiday. And that will be in C427, exceptionally only for this week. So, moving on to trees and relatedness. We often talk about languages being part of a family, but the kind of families we tend to see when we look at linguistic trees are somewhat different from the families that we see in humans. For one thing, humans tend to have 2 parents, languages only ever have 1. So what does it mean to be in a family? What does it mean for English to belong to a family like Germanic or like Indo-European? That's going to be one of the main points today. And it's not just a figure of speech, it's not just a nice metaphor, it actually has very specific content, this claim, and the techniques for establishing that English is a Germanic language and that the Germanic languages are Indo-European languages will be discussed in the first part of today's lecture. So you can see English down here in the bottom left, and English belongs to the Germanic family. Germanic includes many languages with which you will be familiar. It includes North Germanic, that is the Scandinavian languages. It includes other West Germanic languages like German and Dutch of today, also Frisian, Afrikaans. And finally, it includes the now extinct East Germanic branch, of which the main representative is Gothic, the language of the Goths. Germanic as a unit is part of a larger grouping, which includes most of the languages with which you are likely to be familiar. So Germanic belongs to the Indo-European language family, and the mother language here is Proto-Indo-European. Proto-Indo-European is called Proto because it is not attested. We don't have any records of it, and that's why the proto prefix comes in. Similarly with Germanic, the parent language of Germanic is called Proto-Germanic because this is not a language that we have transmitted to us in texts. It's something that we have to reconstruct, and we'll come on to that later. But other Germanic languages include several that have been in contact with English throughout its history. For instance, the Celtic languages, and they are their own separate branch, as you can see. The Italic languages include Latin and Latin's descendants, the Romance languages. So the main branches of Germanic of Western Europe are all here, also Balto-Slavic, the Baltic languages and the Slavic languages like Russian and Ukrainian. There are many other languages that belong to Indo-European as well, from Tocharian to Indo-Iranian. This includes languages like the ancient Sanskrit, Hellenic, this is the branch to which Greek belongs, also Albanian, Phrygian, Armenian, Thracian, Illyrian, and Tocharian. So there are many languages. In fact, almost all of the languages of Europe, in fact, belong to this family, and many beyond. A few that don't are Basque, which is not related to any other known language. Basque is a language spoken in the mountains of the south of France, the north of Spain. Also Finnish and Hungarian, which are related to each other according to the standard theory, but not related to the Indo-European languages of Europe. Where does this family come from? And this is a huge family that seems to have spread all over Europe. And here there are two main theories. One is the steppe hypothesis, and that is represented by the red blob and the red arrows on your map. This hypothesis is associated with Maria Gimbutas, and if you want to find out more about it, this is probably the dominant hypothesis in the literature. If you want to find out more about it, you can read David Anthony's 2007 book, The Horse, the Wheel and Language, which the reference is provided at the end. According to this theory, the Indo-European languages originated in the Caspian steppes, or the Pontic steppes north of the Caspian Sea, in what is present-day southern Russia. And it existed proto-Indo-European, that is, between 4,500 and 2,500 BC. There has been some recent genetic evidence that has been claimed to provide support for this theory. According to the competing Anatolian hypothesis, which is associated with the British archaeologist Colin Renfrew in particular, this is a hypothesis that has its origins in the late part of the 20th century. Essentially, Indo-European did not come from the steppes, instead it came from Asia Minor, aka modern-day Turkey. And these are the yellow blobs and the yellow arrows that you can see on the slide. This yellow blob is older, it's worth noting. According to the Anatolian hypothesis, the Indo-European languages did not spread until after 5000 BC, and the Indo-European proto-language would have been spoken between 7000 and 5000 BC. That is earlier than the window in which it would have been spoken according to the steppe hypothesis. So you can see that there's a lot of uncertainty here. There are different arguments out there, and I'm not going to attempt to resolve the situation, just indicate that there are different theories which make different predictions, and this is still a lively area of research today. So, I've shown you the tree, but the big question is, what does it mean? I've hinted at this already. What does it mean for languages to have families? How do we construct a family like this? How do we know, for instance, that Latin is an Italic language, or that Welsh is a Celtic language, or that English is a Germanic language? For this, we need something called the comparative method. And this is basically a set of techniques, not a very well-defined method overall, but a set of robust techniques that we can use for two tasks. One of them is establishing linguistic relatedness, and the other is carrying out reconstruction. And these two tasks correspond to the two main steps of the method. The first of which is to establish correspondences, and the second of which is to carry out reconstruction. And we'll be talking about these steps in this order. The correspondences are going to be the most crucial for us. Reconstruction is just an interesting side point for today. So, linguistic relatedness. What does it mean for languages to be related? More or less the same as it means for humans to be related. Two languages are related, namely if one of them descends from the other, that is, if there's a direct ancestral relationship between the two languages, or if both are descended from a common source, just like people are related from each other if both of them share an ancestor, whether that be a parent or a grandparent or a great-grandparent or so on. As for how we establish relatedness, the crucial point is sharing systematic sound correspondences. And if a language shares systematic sound correspondences with another language, they have to be related. That's the only conclusion that's compatible with the evidence. So, for that, we need to know what a systematic sound correspondence actually is, and that will be the task of the next part of this lecture. In this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about regular sound change, because this is what we need in order to understand the systematic correspondences that we need for relatedness, and then we'll come back to relatedness once we've covered those. So, the first question is, and this is taking a big step back, why in general can words in different languages sound similar to one another? And you can probably think of many reasons, and here are just a few. The first is language contact and borrowing, and here the classic examples are words like English beef. English beef, along with words like pork, come into the English language during the early Middle English period, in fact, and they come from French. Earlier English would have had a form like simply cow to refer to both the live animal and also the meat. But at this point onwards, English beef is borrowed from French bœuf, and that's explicable in terms of the fact that English and French were in contact with each other during this time. And English, as we know, borrows words from many, many languages. So in English, we also have the word kamikaze for someone who is on a suicide mission, and that comes straight from Japanese kamikaze. So language contact and borrowing can cause languages to become more similar in that it causes elements of one language to be transferred into the other. And that is what's happened in the case of words like beef and kamikaze. Now, words can also be similar by complete chance. So here we have the example of Hawaiian meli and ancient Greek meli, both meaning honey. We also have Hawaiian kia and ancient Greek kion, meaning pillar. You might start thinking, what's going on here? How come we have these words in Hawaiian, a language spoken in Hawaii, and ancient Greek, a language spoken in ancient Greece, that are similar to one another? Now here we can rule out language contact because they're so far apart, these two languages, they're spoken on opposite sides of the world. And that means that language contact isn't a plausible explanation for the facts that we see here, and neither is relatedness. Because, again, on independent grounds, using some of the tools I'll be introducing next, we can tell, in fact, that Hawaiian and ancient Greek are not related. A third reason that languages might have similar sounding words is onomatopoeia. Words simply sound the same because what they refer to is something that sounds the same. So in English, a cow goes moo, and in Chinese, a cow also goes moo, and in German, I am told, a cow also goes moo. Taking another example, the sound that is made by this guy in the background, a cockerel. In English, this word is cock-a-doodle-doo. I don't know where the doodle-doo comes from, but it gets the general feel of it right. In Lingala, the word is kokoliko. In Finnish, it's kukukieku, and in German, it is kikeriki, or something like that. Sorry, I'm not very good at pronouncing these onomatopoeic words. In any case, you can see that these words are similar, and they're similar in that they have lots of k sounds in them. Why do they have lots of k sounds in them? Because that's the sound that this creature makes. Now, of course, this creature is not actually saying any of these things, but it's making a sound that is something like with something that sounds a bit like a human velar fricative in it. And it's therefore no surprise that in language after language, what we see is a word with velar fricatives in it. So language contact can cause languages to sound more similar, coincidence can cause languages to look similar, and onomatopoeia can cause languages to look similar. But there is another reason that languages might have similar words, and that is the one that we're really interested in here. That is, the two languages are related. And it's actually quite easy to tell apart the situation in which languages are related from the situation in which the languages are in contact, or in which there's a coincidental resemblance, or in which there's onomatopoeia. And that's because when two languages are related, we don't just find one or two or three words that sound similar, we find whole swathes of words that correspond with each other very, very precisely in key features. So on the table on this side, you can see 5 Germanic languages, and Germanic is a sub-branch of Indo-European, as we've seen, English, Dutch, German, Danish, and Swedish. And we can see that in each of these languages, there is a word for house, mouse, louse, out, and brown. As you've heard, in English, the vowel is an ow. In German, it's something that's very, very similar, au. So house, mouse, louse, aus, and brown. In Dutch, it is something a little bit different, huis, with more rounding of the vowels, muis, etc. And Danish and Swedish have a different pronunciation again. The Danish pronunciation contains a glottal stop, the Swedish pronunciation is just a long oo. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce those. But in all of these cases, we don't just see words that look similar, we see that every single time we have an ow in an English word, we have an o in the Dutch word, we have an ow in the German word, we have an oo in the Swedish word. And this is what I mean by systematic correspondences, systematic sound correspondences. We're not just dealing with isolated similarities here. This kind of similarity is too good to be due to chance. These sounds they map onto each other so neatly and over so many words that all we can say in this kind of case, all we can conclude is that these are related languages. And the big question here is why? Why do we find this kind of correspondences when we look at related languages? And the answer is due to the title of this section, regular sound change. Sound change is regular. It has a certain property that means essentially, and this takes a little bit of getting used to, so make sure you read up on it if you are interested in this kind of thing. It's not actually words that change at all as far as pronunciation is concerned, it's sounds. Therefore, when we think about words like house, mouse, louse changing, when they change their pronunciation, what's really changing is the ow vowel itself, the ow diphthong, and not the words individually. And when a sound changes, that sound will change in every word in which it is attested. All sounds of that type will be affected, no matter what word or morpheme they occur in, as long as the phonological environmental conditions are met. So not all sound changes affect every instance of a single sound. Sometimes they're conditioned, for instance, to only apply word finally or word medially or something like that. But we don't need to go into the detail of that right now. So in the example that we've just seen, basically the change that we're interested in, at least as far as German is concerned, happens during the early New High German period. And during this time, all instances of the original Germanic vowel u become au sometime between the 12th and the 14th centuries. So we can date this change quite precisely. How? By looking at medieval German manuscripts. And that I defer to a History of German class. When we look at English, we find that exactly the same change has been undergone. So we've got house, mouse, louse, etc. And these words, again, the oo sound that was present in Proto-Germanic has changed. Here, the change responsible is our good old friend, who we saw in the last lecture, the great vowel shift. The great vowel shift has shifted this oo to become the diphthong ow. And in Dutch, something similar has happened. In Swedish, actually, nothing has happened. In this instance, what we see in Swedish, in the column on the right, is the original situation. Swedish has not changed this vowel, and all of the other languages have changed it to some extent. So that's the regularity of sound change. Sounds change in their own right, They are not reliant on individual words changing one by one. Rather, when a sound changes, every instance of that sound is affected. Every word containing that sound is immediately affected at a given time in a given place. As I said, some changes will only affect sounds in certain sound environments. And this is why, for instance, when we compare English and German, we see a sequence of words that begin with a t in English, where the corresponding word seems to begin with a ts in German. So tied to, to, tin, and to the preposition correspond to Zeit, zwei, sehr, zin, and zu. Here, you can see that there's a regular sound change, and the regular sound change has caused all instances of t to change into ts at the beginning of words. Ts here is an affricate. It starts out as a stop and becomes a fricative. So it's represented in German as a Z, but that Z is actually somewhat misleading. And this is a change that German underwent that English didn't undergo sometime before the 9th century, before our early German texts. And what's interesting about this change is it only applies at the beginning of words. So Germanic t at the beginning of words changes into a ts, but Germanic t in the middle of a word or at the end of a word is not affected. It doesn't change into ts during this period. So, relatedness. How does relatedness relate to what we've just been talking about? Well, the answer is hopefully staring you in the face right now. Systematic sound correspondences of the kind that we've seen in the table, both tables, only emerge through regular sound change, and regular sound change is a language internal process. Individual languages undergo sound change, and as a result of that sound change, systematic correspondences will emerge, and that is something that only happens within a language. So regular sound change is basically the key process that allows us to distinguish systematic sound correspondences from the other things that we talked about: borrowing, chance, onomatopoeia, other factors that can make words look similar or sound similar. So systematic sound correspondences are crucial because if we see systematic sound correspondences between two languages, that's a surefire proof that these are related languages. So the regularity of sound change is really important. It's perhaps the single most important finding in all of historical linguistics, because this is not just a principle that applies to English and to German and to the Indo-European languages. This is a principle that can be applied to any language everywhere. Regular sound change is all over the place. Okay, so we've got as far as systematic sound correspondences and relatedness. And one thing we can ask now is there anything else we can do with these family trees? And it turns out that there is. Once we know that languages are related, we also know that they are descended from a common ancestor. And if we know that, we can ask another question, which is what that common ancestor looked like. We can try and figure out what Proto-Germanic or Proto-Indo-European might have looked like, and essentially restore a piece of it to life today. This is an enterprise that I myself have been involved in to some extent. My PhD was about this, and there are some nice little quotes around. So here we've got Kolaminis saying, "Linguistic history is basically the darkest of the dark arts, the only means to conjure up the ghosts of vanished centuries." This is a lovely little quote. I think he's probably exaggerating a little bit about how scary it is, but let's see in more detail what's possible and what's not, and how it helps us understand the prehistory of the English language. So as I said, now we've got this tree model of language relatedness, we can ask what else can we do, and one of the things we can do is reconstruct the ancestral stages. One example is the mother of the Indo-European languages, Proto-Indo-European. We don't know what this looked like for the simple reason that no one was writing it down. We know that it must have existed, but at the time, people weren't making records, or most likely, or those records have not survived to us. So can we tell what this language looked like? Same with Proto-Germanic. Proto-Germanic is the hypothetical mother of the Indo-European languages. You can see that in the tree here. Germanic is here, and that means that there must have been a mother language here, Proto-Germanic, from which all of these branches of Germanic are descended. So, can we tell what that looked like? And the answer is yes, at least to some extent. And this is something that people have been at for a long, long time. August Schleicher, who was a German comparative philologist, felt confident enough in his knowledge of Proto-Indo-European to write a short story in it. And you can see that here. This is a story about sheep and horses. And this is a strange little story. Now, the details of what Schleicher thought Proto-Indo-European looked like have been subject to change over the years. So modern versions of a story like this wouldn't quite look the same. But it's amazing how much of the method that Schleicher used has essentially survived to us today. How much we can say this kind of word, this kind of little story is actually pretty plausible as a reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, even if we don't agree with all of the details. Now, this, of course, comes with some fairly huge caveats. One of them is, this is a story about sheep and horses, and it's quite carefully constructed because it's carefully constructed around the words that we're most confident about. And the words that we're most confident about for Proto-Indo-European are precisely words about sheep and about horses and about agriculture and that kind of thing. There are other lexical domains, other semantic domains, where we're not so confident about what the language would have looked like. But in general, this is a remarkable success story, the fact that all of our methods point in the same direction to the same kind of result. So how do we reconstruct things then? Well, here we need to use systematic correspondences again. I've used the word proto a couple of times, or rather the prefix proto. Proto simply means it's been reconstructed. It's the product of comparative reconstruction. So Proto-Germanic is a reconstructed Germanic language, and it's made up of proto-sounds, proto-words, etc. And we use a little asterisk to mark the proto-form. But let's dig into an example now. When we look at the Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, we find that in words like goat and top, Italian has a P that corresponds to a Spanish B and a Portuguese B. So we can see that the word for goat in Italian is capra, the word in Spanish is cabra, and the word in Portuguese, in this case, is the same. And so we've got a correspondence here, and I could list more words where you've got an Italian P corresponding to a Spanish and Portuguese B. I've just given two for simplicity. So we know that the three languages are related. So what do we reconstruct for the ancestor language? Well, it seems like there are a few different possibilities, right? One thing we could do is to reconstruct Italian P. We could say that Italian represents the original situation. The other thing we could do is reconstruct a B for Proto-Romance and say, well, in Spanish and in Portuguese, there's this B, and that is also what we can reconstruct for the Proto-language. Another possibility would be to reconstruct something else entirely that has no relation to what we find in modern Italian or Spanish. But we can rule that out because it seems to be the least simple solution. So our basic choice is between P and B, and we can resolve this by looking at how common certain sound changes are. And one thing we know about sound change is that intervocalic voicing is very common, and more generally, voicing between two voiced sounds. Now, B is a voiced sound. P is a voiceless sound. Hopefully you remember this from your Shi1 knowledge. Vowels and R are voiced sounds. So if you think about what you're doing in a Latin word like capra, you're going from a voiced sound, A, to a voiceless sound, P, to another voiced sound, R. And in Spanish and Portuguese, you don't have that. You've got voicing all the way through, abre, or abre. And the Italian situation is something that often in language change turns into the Spanish and Portuguese type situation. So we often find p in precisely this situation between two voiced sounds changing into a b. Remember that these two sounds differ in only one feature, and it's whether they're voiced or not, the feature of voicing. So when p becomes b, it's becoming voiced. And it's essentially making the pronunciation of these words very, very slightly easier. And because we know that that direction of sound change is common, and that the opposite change, a b becoming d-voiced in a voiced environment, is rare, we can use that knowledge to say that the situation we see in Italian is likely to be closer to the original proto-form. In fact, we can just say that it is essentially the proto-form in this case. So the change in this case has happened in Portuguese and in Spanish, and it's changed p into b between voiced sounds. So we reconstruct p. And what's great about Romance, and the reason I've used a Romance example here, despite the fact that this is English linguistics, is that in Romance we have a very special situation, which is that essentially we know where these languages sprung from. We know that they have an ancestor, and that ancestor is essentially Latin. And so we can reconstruct, and we can check our reconstructions against what we find in Latin. So here we can tell that our method is working perfectly, because it gives us precisely the result we'd expect to find. In Latin you get capra for goat and caput for top, in both cases with a p. So here we've got striking confirmation of the method that we've used, of the reconstructive method that we've used. Now, of course, we don't always have this possibility. We can't always check our reconstructions against the historical record. In fact, the very reason that we reconstruct is usually that we don't have a historical record. And that's the case for Germanic. We don't have any equivalent of Latin, a mother language attested in the Germanic family. We don't have anything remotely equivalent for Proto-Indo-European either. But nevertheless, because our methods work so well, when we have something to check them against, we can also infer that they work well in the cases where we don't have something to check them against too, as in Germanic and Proto-Indo-European. Now, I've picked out Indo-European and Germanic and Romance examples, and there's plenty to be said about Indo-European historical linguistics. And a lot of it is said in the textbook by Claxon that I've referenced here. This is a nice introductory treatment that goes into quite a lot of depth about the linguistics of the Indo-European language family in the broader sense, and about the early representatives of that family, like Latin and ancient Greek and Sanskrit. If you're interested in that, by all means take a look. We won't be delving further into that kind of thing during this course. What's important to note at this point is that the comparative method, as discussed here, has been applied to all kinds of languages from all over the world. So it's been successfully applied to the Native American languages of North America, to the Mayan languages of South America, to the Bantu languages of Africa, to the Finno-Ugric languages of Eurasia, and to many, many more families around the world. I can't list them all because essentially this method has been applied to basically all the languages, or it's in the process of being applied to all the languages. So this is a really striking success of historical linguistics, this comparative method that we've talked about. Moving on to the innovations that define Germanic then. So why do we say that Germanic is a sub-branch of Indo-European? And the reasons are the same as why we would say that any sub-branch is a sub-branch of anything. And that's that there are shared innovations, new developments that these languages have all collectively undergone, which we can only find in this branch. And this is something that we can talk about in detail. In Germanic, there are three specific changes that are going to be important. The first is a stress shift. So in Proto-Indo-European, a bit like in modern English, the stress could go pretty much anywhere in a word. In Germanic, on the other hand, in the early Germanic languages, what we find is first syllable stress. The first syllable of a word gets stressed, with a very few exceptions. And that's still the case as a tendency for a language like German or Dutch. English, as I say, has moved away from it to some extent, and we'll explore why later in the course. But this is an innovation that sets Germanic apart from the other Indo-European languages where stress is still more variable, or where it fixes in a different pattern. The second major innovation is what's called the dental preterite, or the weak past tense. You may have noticed that in all of the Germanic languages, there is a past tense form that ends in a d or a t. So in English, we have play and played for the past tense. In German, we have spielen and spielte, and d and t are dental sounds, and they're used to form the past tense for regular verbs in these languages. And that is something that all the Germanic languages share, but which none of the other Indo-European languages share. And we'll come back to how that arose. The final change, and the one that is most often mentioned, is Grimm's law. Grimm's law is a sound change, and it's a really big, exciting sound change. So Grimm, and this is the same Grimm, by the way, of the fairy tale collecting Brothers Grimm, he was one of the first to notice a series of changes in all of the Germanic languages that seem to be related. And these changes collectively are known as Grimm's law, or the first consonant shift. And there are, as I said, various components to this change. But when you look at this change, it's actually fairly orderly in many respects. If you look at the first column, we have p becoming f, we have t becoming f, that's what this theta symbol stands for in the International Phonetic Alphabet. We have k becoming h, and so in all of these cases, we have a sound that is a voiceless stop becoming a voiceless fricative with the same place of articulation. In the second column, we have b becoming p, d becoming t, and g becoming k. So this column involves a voiced stop becoming a voiceless stop with the same place of articulation. Finally, we've got a slightly different set of sounds. These are called voiced aspirate sounds, and with my nose all bunged up with hay fever, I'm not sure I'll do a good job of pronouncing them, and I'm not sure you'll hear them over the microphone, but they are, I will exaggerate, something like b, d, g, with an extra blow of air at the end. And these voiced aspirated stops become normal stops with the same place of articulation. So they become b, d, and g, respectively. So this is quite a wide-ranging change. It affects a total of 9 different sounds, all of which change regularly. And I mean, this is a big deal, and we only find it in the Germanic languages. We do not find it in, say, Romance. We don't find it in Indo-Iranian. We don't find it in Celtic or Slavic or anywhere else. Grimm's law is a specifically Germanic phenomenon. Here are some examples of the kind of correspondences, the kind of systematic correspondences that this gives rise to. So on the left-hand side of the table, you've got some non-Germanic Indo-European languages: Sanskrit, Ancient Greek, Latin, and Old Church Slavonic. And in these languages, we can see a T in each case. And this is an unconditioned change. This change, Grimm's law, is not like the change we discussed before that causes German tide and German Zeit and English tide to correspond. That's a conditioned sound change. It only affects sounds in word initial position. Grimm's law affects sounds in every position. Another reason that it's such a sweeping sound change, such a big deal. Now, in the non-Germanic languages, we consistently see a t. It's in bold in the table, in words for brother, three, thin, be silent, and all other words, in fact. And in Germanic, what we instead see is a fricative. It is a th sound. And as you can see, this is the symbol that we use to represent it in the Germanic languages. Typically, it is this thing which looks like a combination of a B and P. This is called a thorn. And when we get on to talking about the writing systems of the Germanic languages, you will hear more about thorn. But this thorn stands for a th. It stands for the sound that is also represented by theta in the International Phonetic Alphabet, this th fricative, a dental fricative. And in the Germanic languages, we consistently have th, where the non-Germanic languages consistently have t. So this is an illustration of a systematic sound correspondence caused by Grimm's law. Now, I've had to introduce a fair bit of knowledge from the general field of historical linguistics, and if you're interested in that, sometimes we offer a course in historical linguistics that picks up on some of this material, that talks more about sound changes and syntactic changes and morphological changes and systematic correspondences, not only in English and Germanic, but around the world, and about the methods of historical linguistics in general. If you're interested in the meantime, you can check out Campbell's 2013 Introduction to Historical Linguistics textbook, which will give you more detail on the stuff that we've discussed in this section and in the previous section. And it's not only sounds that change and set apart the Germanic languages from the other Indo-European languages. Grammatical change also occurs, syntactic and morphological change, and that's what we're going to briefly look at now. Two major changes that set apart the Germanic languages from the other Indo-European languages. The first is one I've just mentioned, the dental preterite, and as I've said, this is one of the defining features of Germanic. So the dental preterite is simply the way of forming a finite past tense form in the Germanic languages, also past participles in weak verbs in most of these languages. So we have d, t, s, th. These are all dental sounds, approximately at least. And in English, as I've said, we have play and played. The past tense form is formed with this d. The same is true in Danish, the same is true in Dutch, the same is true in Swedish. The same is true, in fact, in all of the Germanic languages except for German. And in German, instead, we have a t. So German spielen and spielte. And this is to do with another change that happens in German that doesn't happen in the other Germanic languages. This is a German-specific change. If you've done any history of German, this is called the second sound shift, zweite Lautverschiebung, or Hochdeutsche Lautverschiebung, the High German sound shift. Regardless, it doesn't change the fact that we're dealing with a dental here, that we're forming our past tense with a dental. As I've said, this is something that only the Germanic languages have. The other Indo-European languages do not have it. So one thing we can ask is, where did it come from? And the most likely story, there are different theories, but the most likely story is that this dental preterite emerged by combining a form of the main verb with a form of the verb to do, which in Proto-Indo-European, in Proto-Germanic would have been dawn. And here we have evidence in Gothic, which I've mentioned before, the other Germanic language, the one that died out. We have 4th century evidence from Gothic, and when we look at the past plural of a regular verb like nasian, which means to save in this language, what we find is nasidedun. And if we break this up, if we break this nasidedun up, it looks like we've got nasi and dedun. And dedun is simply the past form of the verb to do. And that is a very, very striking similarity, which suggests that the way of forming these past forms in Proto-Germanic was to take a form of the verb and to add on something like did at the end. So if you wanted to say the past tense of I save someone, you would say I saved did. And over time, what happened is that those two forms, the save and the did, ended up getting glued together. So nasi dedun would have become nasi dedun as a single word. This is something that very often happens in language change. It's called univerbation. It's a pretentious term for when two words or more become a single word. And univerbation is a characteristic of a very, very, very common type of language change called grammaticalization, where lexical items become more grammatical and independent words become clitics and affixes. That is, morphologically independent words lose their original morphological autonomy and become bound morphemes. So this is something that we see very often in language change, which in turn is a strong reason to suggest that precisely what we've suggested is what happened, that a form of do got attached to the end of a form of the lexical verb. And of course, this didn't just happen to the verb to save, it happened to every verb. He play, past tense would be he play did, with a form of this did, and that would get compressed over time to he play did, and the two does would get mushed together, and eventually it would end up with he played. So this is, if you like, a kind of regular syntactic change, a regular morphosyntactic change. And again, as I've said, it's one of the defining features of the Germanic languages. The Germanic languages also show another development, which is the development from synthetic to analytic. This is something we touched upon last time. Recall that we defined synthetic as meaning referring to a language with a high ratio of morphemes to words, essentially. This is a language in which grammatical information, semantic information, is expressed to a high degree by separate morphemes as part of the same word. And a classical case of a synthetic language is Sanskrit. In Sanskrit, you have 8 different cases. So there are more cases in Sanskrit than there are in German or Latin, for instance. You have the ones that you should all be familiar with, the nominative, the accusative, the dative, and the genitive. But as well as those, you have another 4 separate forms. One is the instrumental. So the instrumental is a case which is for the instrument with which an action takes place. You often see weapons, for instance, as instrumental case elements because weapons are often instruments. Locative, very simple. It's about the where something is happening. Ablative is about the source, so the cause or the origin of a given action or event. And the vocative is the case that is used for noun phrases that refer to the person who's being addressed. So, hey you, that would be a vocative. Or if you come to my office hours, hallo, Prof. Dr. Walkden, or whatever. These are vocatives. And in the early Indo-European languages, including Sanskrit, these had a separate case form. And here you've got an example. The sentence Rama lives in the forest. This is a sentence which we need 5 words for in modern English. In Sanskrit, you can do it with just 3. Rama, forest, lives. And because there is case marking on Rama, there is case marking on forest, there is verb agreement marking on the verb, this T in vasati shows you that you have a third person singular verb form. Because you have all that morphological information, you don't need extra words like in, and you don't need words like the either. So synthetic language makes more use of morphology and less use of grammatical function words and of fixed word order. At least that's the traditional story. And you can see in the table on the right some of what the case endings look like. They are quite distinct. So sometimes the case endings look the same, as in the dative plural and the ablative plural that you can see on the right. We've got devevias and devevias in the dative and ablative plural here. But otherwise, you can see that these case forms are really quite distinct in many of the cells of this table. And that means that these case endings convey grammatical information and semantic information as well. Here we see further details of what happens. Again, at the top of the slide here, we can see a very simple sentence, simple at least in terms of it's only got 3 words in it. He goes from the city to the forest, and this is formed of city, forest, goes. And here we can see again, there's an ablative case marker on the city because this is the source of his movement. This is where he starts. The forest has an accusative because it's the object, and you have a T, third person agreement on the verb, and no subject pronoun he. Again, this is a common feature of the early Indo-European languages, and the early Germanic languages too. In Hindi Urdu, which is the modern descendant of Sanskrit, very widely spoken language today, or languages, we can see that many, many more words are needed to say exactly the same thing. So, he, city, from, forest, to, go, be. Now we have 7 words where we previously had 3, but these are much, much shorter words with much less morphology. So this illustrates the trend from synthetic to analytic. We've lost the case endings on the words city and forest, and we've got grammatical words like he and from and to and is appearing. And one of the reasons I didn't mention this in the defining features of Germanic is that although Germanic does become less synthetic and more analytic over time, remember these are the same thing, more analytic equals less synthetic, they're just the 2 ways of saying the same thing. Germanic is not the only branch of Indo-European to do this. In fact, pretty much every branch of Indo-European has become more analytic and less synthetic over time. What's striking about Germanic is that we have some of the least synthetic languages, some of the most analytic languages in the whole Indo-European family. And English is among them. In fact, English and Afrikaans, the West Germanic language spoken in South Africa, are probably the 2 most analytic of all of the modern Indo-European standard languages. So we've seen a very dramatic development from synthetic to analytic in the Germanic languages, perhaps even more so than in other branches of the Indo-European family, although we do see the same trend in other branches. This next segment is a bit of a fish out of water because we are going to take a step back from Germanic and we're going to look at writing systems, starting out from writing systems across the world. And that's partly because the writing systems used for the earliest Germanic languages are actually very interesting in their own right. But let's start with talking about writing systems in general. So the earliest human writing emerged in Henan in China, and we have evidence from this basically from over 8,000 years ago. That's a heck of a long time, and that is the earliest thing that looks like writing we can possibly identify. However, these writings are probably not actually representative of a systematic writing system, as in a system designed specifically to represent language. Rather, they seem to be ad hoc symbols for particular needs. Other inscriptions that look more like a systematic writing system are represented by the Vinca inscriptions from 7,000 years ago, and a little bit more recently, 5,500 years ago, you get the Indus Valley writing, or Harappan, which is obviously younger, but by this point we're dealing with something that is indisputably human language. Indisputably a writing system designed to represent human language in a long-term, durable written form. A little bit more recently, 200 years later, we get our first attestations of Egyptian, and 200 years later again, we get our first attestations of Mesopotamian cuneiform. Now, cuneiform is very, very interesting. You can see an image here on the slide of some cuneiform. Cuneiform is all angles and pointy ends. It's basically designed for writing with a wedge. That's what cuneiform means in German Keilschrift. And you use it, you can either make a line with the wedge, or you can jab the wedge and make a little triangle. And basically everything that you see in the cuneiform writing system is some combination of lines and little triangles. And it's used for various languages of the ancient Near East. So languages of Mesopotamia, such as Sumerian, Akkadian, and the Indo-European language Hittite as well. What's really interesting about all of this is that writing systems don't seem to have only developed once in the history of the species. They seem to have developed several times. And Mesoamerica, Greater Mesopotamia, China, and Southern Europe all seem to independently develop their own writing systems. That is, they develop them without influence from any of the existing writing systems. That is quite a striking fact about human script, human representation of knowledge, of culture, of language. So whatever happened, humans must have been predisposed to develop writing by this time. When we look at different types of writing system, we find that they're not all the same. And there are three basic types. The first type is called a logographic type of writing system, and this is a system where a symbol represents a single word. There aren't all that many writing systems that are literally always like this, that are real logographic writing systems. Sometimes it's said that the Chinese characters are a logographic writing system. They're not really, because sometimes one word is represented by more than one symbol. And also, there is a phonological component to the Chinese characters. Nevertheless, an ideal, or in principle, the ideal, the most prototypical logographic system would be one in which every word is expressed by one and only one symbol. So there's a mapping, a one-to-one mapping between words and written symbols. The other potential thing that symbols can map to is the syllable, and these are our syllabic writing systems. The way that the cuneiform writing system that we saw on the previous slide was used for Hittite is a syllabic writing system. And here, each symbol represents a syllable with its onset nucleus and coda, with its normal syllable structure. Hopefully this is something that you will recall from your Shi1 days, basic syllable structure. The final type of writing system is one in which each symbol represents a single sound, a single segment. And this is the kind of writing system that we are all familiar with, because it's the kind of writing system used by English, by German, and by most of the other languages that are widely spoken in Western Europe. So in principle, in English, one symbol is supposed to represent one sound. As we know, there are deviations from this. Sometimes the same symbol can represent different sounds, or different symbols can represent the same sound. So modern English is far from a prototypical alphabetic writing system, but nevertheless, it is more an alphabetic writing system than, let's say, Hittite or Chinese characters. So we're dealing with an alphabetic writing system. In modern English, we use specifically the Latin alphabet. Let's take another example. Here you have Egyptian hieroglyphs. And Egyptian hieroglyphs, like Chinese characters of today, are partly logographic. So it's, to some extent, it's the case that a single character represents a single word, but not exclusively. So here you can see two examples. On the left, you've got the word neb, which means basket. This is also the word for every. And you can see how this would represent a basket, but it's more difficult to see why this symbol would represent every. The reason it does is simply that in ancient Egyptian, every was pronounced the same as basket, so they used the same symbol. It's a bit like if in German you use the little picture of a dog, Hund, to represent the conjunction and, because und and Hund sound similar. That would be the kind of logic of what's going on here. Similarly, we have two different words, Ra, meaning sun, and Hru, meaning day, both represented by this round symbol on the right. And this symbol, it's quite clear why it would represent the sun, because the sun seems to be round, although it's not a good idea to look at it for too long. As for Hru, well, the reason that that is the same symbol is because a day involves the sun rising and setting once. So here you've got a single symbol standing for two different words with two different pronunciations that are nevertheless semantically linked. So we're basically dealing with a system here that is partially logographic and partially syllabic in the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now, the first attestations of the Germanic languages that we have are written in an alphabetic writing script, but that is not the Latin alphabet. They use their own script, which is the Runic alphabet, or Elder Futhark, as it's called. And here you can see it on the slide. Now, the Elder Futhark is descended from Old Italic scripts, so it goes back to a script that was used on the continent. It wasn't developed independently, and you can see that there are similarities between these letters and certain letters of the Latin alphabet, for instance. And the Elder Futhark is used in the first millennium from about 150 AD until 800 AD. So the Elder Futhark predates English. It's older than English. And it's used for a variety of inscriptions, the earliest of which are extremely interesting because they plausibly represent a stage of Germanic in which the North and West Germanic languages have not yet split. In other words, this might be the common ancestor of both the North Germanic languages of Scandinavia and the West Germanic languages of essentially Germany and the rest of Western Europe. So you can see the alphabet here, and it has certain features that make it very well suited for its purpose. So like the cuneiform, you can see that it's largely made up of straight lines. And again, there's a reason for that. That's because the runes were not designed to be written with a pen, they were designed to be carved. So you take a knife and you carve the runes into bone, into wood, into stone, into something like that, depending on how hard you're willing to work. And if you've ever tried to carve anything in wood or carve anything into stone, especially, you will know that it's a heck of a lot easier to carve a straight line than it is to carve a curve. So that's why the runic alphabet looks the way it does, with all of its pointy edges and jagged lines. Here's an example. This is something you've seen earlier on the title slide to this section. The Golden Horns of Galahus. This is one of our earliest runic inscriptions. This inscription was found on a horn. One of the exciting things about the runic inscriptions is they're not just found in texts, on tablets, they're found rather on objects, on interesting objects. And this particular object was a horn. It was one of two golden horns discovered in Denmark. The first was discovered in 1639, the second was discovered in 1734. These horns did not survive to the present day because, being made of gold, they were quite valuable, and as a result, in the 19th century, they were stolen and melted. However, fortunately, someone had made a drawing of the horn before that happened, and so they were able to make replicas of the horn, even though the originals had been lost and the gold had been sold. And the smaller horn has a runic inscription. You can see it at the top right-hand side of the screen. If you want to have a go at transliterating this yourself, you are more than welcome, but you may find that it does not make much sense to you because it is not written in a language that you are likely to be able to read. Specifically, it's written in potentially plausibly common Northwest Germanic. Here is an Old English runic object, because in the very early days of the writing of Old English, runes were used here too. And this is a beautiful casket, bone casket, that is to be found in the British, it says here the British Library, I think that should be the British Museum. And this panel has a runic inscription going around the outside, so you can see the runes around the edge of the image, and the image shows boys being suckled by wolves. And if you try to decode the runes here, if you transliterate them into the Roman alphabet, you find that the first ones say this is an R here, an O, an M, a W, an A, an L, a U, and finally this jagged S, which nevertheless looks a bit like the S that we have today. So this spells out Romulus. And if you know anything about the history of Rome, you might recognize this as Romulus, one of the two brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were said to be raised by wolves and were the founders of the city of Rome in Italy. As our final topic for this lecture, we're going to look at whether we can go even further back than Indo-European. As we've seen, Indo-European was spoken sometime between, well, 3 or 7 millennia BC, depending on which theory you believe. And that leaves an awful lot of human history unaccounted for, because humans have been around for a lot longer than that. So can we go even further back? Can we construct larger families that try and link Indo-European with the other families of the world, for instance? Now, at the very start, we obviously have the evolution of language itself, as in how did language arise biologically in the human species? This capacity for language that we all have, that you've heard about in Shi 1, for instance, how did this arise? How come we can do this thing that's called language, and rabbits and rocks and other things, other objects, other animals, nothing on Earth has the ability to learn language like we can? So how did this evolve? This is a complicated question, and we're only going to be able to give the briefest of outlines here. First of all, the dominant theory is that language probably only evolved once, and it evolved before the human race essentially left Africa. So the human race dispersed from its African origins at some point between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. Now, before that, language must have evolved. If it only evolved once, it has to have evolved before this split. And the current consensus is that it probably only evolved sometime between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago. 200,000 is the most recent possible date, because after that, we have genetic evidence saying that the groups of the world today have been distinct groups. Some of them have for at least that long. So 200,000 years ago is the most recent estimate. 300,000 years ago is probably the most distant realistic estimate, though some people argue that it was even earlier. And this relates to the question of whether our close relations, the Neanderthals, also had language, or whether it was just Homo sapiens. As yet, we have very little evidence to make strong claims about that either way. And it's probably likely that we will never be able to know for sure. Though, in this field, historical genetics is making progress all the time, and so it might be that discoveries are made that will affect our understanding of the evolution of language in the near future. What about between 100,000 years ago and 7,000 years ago? Can we go further back than Indo-European without trying to go back to the beginning of time itself, essentially? Well, the comparative method that we've been using, as we've seen, relies on regular sound change. It relies on the fact that it's sounds that change, not words, and that those regular sound changes affect whole classes of words at once and give rise to our systematic sound correspondences. But the problem is that the further we go back in time, the more these effects become obscured, and they can be obscured by various different means. Some of them we've touched on already. Words can be borrowed from one language into another, for instance. And when a word is borrowed, obviously the new word doesn't give us evidence for earlier sound changes that might have happened in the prehistory, and usually a borrowed word replaces an existing word that might have told us more about the prehistoric sound status of a given language. So borrowing is a problem. Changing word meaning is also a problem, because it stops us from being able to recognize when two words actually correspond. Normally, we require words to correspond only fairly loosely in meaning, but over time, as we'll see in the rest of the course, meaning change can be quite dramatic. And so word meaning can stop us from being able to recognize potential related words, potential cognates. The other thing, of course, that can step in is further regular sound changes. And the more sound changes take place, the more complex the whole system gets, and the harder it becomes to discover what's really there. And that really is the take-home message from this slide. Reconstructing protoforms and establishing relatedness, both steps of the comparative method, become essentially, if not impossible, then very, very difficult. And essentially, if we try and apply the methods further back in time than about 6,000 years, maybe 10,000 years at the absolute outside, the results are no better than noise, they're no better than chance. That is, we can make proposals about this early period, we can just be we can't be very sure about them because all of these intervening factors, all of these extra factors such as borrowing and semantic change will mess up our data and make it impossible to be able to be certain. Not, of course, that we can ever be really certain anyway when it comes to language history. And one response to this is to say, well, in that case, let's give up on the comparative method. Let's give up on the techniques that we have talked about in the early part of this lecture, and instead to essentially make educated guesses about relatedness based on just looking at a lot of words and seeing whether they're similar or not. It's generally agreed that this method is not reliable. This is a method called mass comparison or multilateral comparison. You take a whole load of languages, you look at a whole load of words, and you just look for surface similarities, and that is your evidence for relatedness, essentially. And obviously the problem with this is something that we've talked about when we first started talking about regular sound change in the second segment of this lecture. Similarity between words can result from many, many sources. It can result from onomatopoeia, it can result from borrowing, it can result from complete chance, among other things. So basically, you can't tell anything just by comparing words. But of course, people have tried to do that. And the idea that you can go further back using these methods as far back as proto-world, that is, the common ancestor of all languages, that is, in other words, we're constructing a tree here that contains all of the world's languages. That idea is associated with Joseph Greenberg and with Merritt Ruhlen, and it's an idea that is widely rejected in historical linguistics. Nevertheless, because it's kind of out there and crazy and exciting, it often gets into the media, and so sometimes these ideas get more currency, more traction in the popular media than they actually deserve. So it's worthwhile being skeptical whenever you see any claim about any language change or any language history that goes back further than about 10,000 years, at the absolute limit. Another family that is not quite as controversial as Proto-World, but still not widely accepted, is Nostratic. Now, Nostratic is a proposed macro family, that just means it's a big family, and it includes the Indo-European languages, and it includes a few other families as well, including Uralic, which is the family to which Finnish and Turkish belong, Finnish, Estonian, Hungarian, Afroasiatic, the family to which the Semitic languages like Arabic, Berber, and Hebrew belong, Kartvelian, the languages of Georgia and the Caucasus, Turkic, including Turkish, also many other languages of Asia, and even more. So this is a big family, but it still doesn't even go close to including all of the languages of the world. It only really includes those languages that have their origin in Eurasia, that is Europe and Asia. And this idea was developed more or less independently by a set of different linguists, Ilich Svitic and Dolgopolsky in Russia, and Alan Bomhard in America. And they've tried quite hard to argue that there is a signal here, that there is not just noise, that there is genuine evidence for relatedness. And they've done so using the normal comparative method, not multilateral comparison. However, this also is not widely accepted because the results are considered by most to be relatively sparse, to be indistinguishable from chance. And if you want to find out more about these general issues of language relatedness, you can look at Campbell and Poser 2008, who have a book on this question. And they criticize both Nostratic and Proto-World. In general, their attitude is a fairly skeptical one. It's worth noting before we finish that language history, especially the kind of language history I presented today with families and so on, is not an apolitical act. And it's easy to see that if you go on YouTube or you go on Facebook and you go into various groups, you will find people who like to argue that a certain language is the oldest language in the world. And usually, almost always, that language is their own native language. So you get Turks arguing that Turkish is the world's oldest language, which all of the other languages descend from. You get people from the Middle East arguing that Arabic is the world's oldest language, that all of the world's languages descend from Classical Arabic. You get people, even in places like the Netherlands, arguing that Dutch is the world's oldest language and that all languages descend from Dutch. And obviously, this means things to people. This is a meaningful act. People, especially people with a particular sort of nationalist agenda, are quite keen to emphasize the antiquity of their own language, how old and worthy it is. And in the 20th century, that precise kind of ideology has been linked to various political movements that have used Indo-European studies, used the linguistic study of Indo-European to fuel a political point. So the Aryan myth, for instance, Leon Polyakov has discussion of this. This was at the heart of some of what the Nazis did, for instance. And more generally, Edward Said has argued that in his book Orientalism, that Indo-European studies and historical linguistics in general has been used as a tool, even as recently as the 20th century, for enforcing or justifying colonialism and imperialism. And it's also the case that modern far-right groups sometimes draw on Indo-European and Germanic philology in order to try to create an image for themselves of their past, of their glorious past. And there's a link here on the slide if you want to find out more about this issue, which is something that specialists in Old English and in the early Germanic languages in particular have been forced to come to terms with over the last few years, increasingly so. All right, then, to wrap up today's lecture, first of all, we've looked at the comparative method. This enables us to establish language relatedness. It also allows us to reconstruct ancestor languages that are usually themselves unattested. That's the whole point of reconstruction. And we can do this because sound change has the property of regularity. When sounds change, they affect all words in which they are contained, and that yields systematic sound correspondences. English is a Germanic language, specifically a West Germanic language. West Germanic belongs to Germanic. Germanic belongs to Indo-European. Further back than that, Indo-European might belong to a larger family, like Nostratic. It almost certainly does, in fact, belong to some such family, but the details are controversial and probably can't be reconstructed by means of the comparative method. Turning to Germanic, we define it by three major innovations: Grimm's law, the dental preterite, and the accent shift. And the earliest Germanic writing system is the Elder Futhark Runic system. And I think that is all you can take away from today's somewhat mixed bag of a lecture. What you need to do now is have a go at exercises 1 to 4 on pages 48 to 49 of the textbook. This is on Ilias for you. You need to attend the tutorial this week. Remember that the Wednesday tutorial will exceptionally be on Tuesday. You need to read chapter 3 of the textbook, and next week I will be back and I will be telling you about Old English itself, the first stage of the English language for which we have actual texts.